Hey guys, in this series of videos we are going to be talking about the works of Charles Bukowski. I have several collections of his here and I will be pulling poems from some of these different collections to talk about. I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer here and remind everybody that Charles Bukowski is a gruff and crass old man, and his poems do reflect that. Some of these are going to be very sexual in nature and contain a lot of graphic of words and concepts. If that is the thing that is just not for you, then please be sure and click out of this video, and because I can't guarantee what the content is going to be on each individual poem. Some of the poems that I talk about won't have such strong language and content, but some probably will. So again, if that's just not your thing, then please just click out of these videos. But if you're interested in my thoughts on some of Charles Bukowski's collection of works, his poetry here, then be sure and stick around and see which poem I choose to discuss this week. Hey y'all, it's Jen and welcome back to my channel, Ifra's Inklings. Today is a Bukowski poetry discussion, and it is going to come from You Get So Alone at Times, It Just Makes Sense, this collection. And I want to talk about the poem titled Final Story, and it goes like this. God, there he is drunk again, telling the same old stories over and over again. As they push him for more, some with nothing else to do, others secretly snickering at this great writer, babbling, drooling in his little white rat whiskers, talking about war, talking about the wars, talking about the brave fish, the bullfights, even about his wives. The people come into the bar night after night for the same old show, which he will one day end alone, blowing his brains to the walls. The price of creation is never too high. The price of living with other people always is. This poem is clearly about Ernest Hemingway. Charles Bukowski actually writes a lot of poetry that references Hemingway and Ezra Pound, Scott Fitzgerald, several other great writers, but this one is definitely Ernest Hemingway. There's no doubt about it. You've got the reference to the bullfights, to the wars, to his wives, to his suicide, to his drinking. All of these things are all things that are referenced in the life of Hemingway, things that we know about Ernest Hemingway. And I think that this poem was probably written right about the time of Hemingway's death. I don't know that, but I just kind of get that impression that this was Bukowski's way of processing his friend's suicide. And in this poem, you know, it opens up with them talking about him being drunk and telling the same stories over and over again, and people badgering him about it and kind of snickering and making fun of this old drunk washed up writer, talking about the past. I think that while that may be comical or entertaining for somebody, for a younger person, to laugh and joke about, you know, the old person telling these old war stories or telling these stories about his life that were so, you know, obviously are probably embellished a little bit. Hemingway definitely embellished some of his stories, even in his A Movable Feast that is supposed to be semi-autobiographical. I mean, those stories are obviously kind of fictionalized. Even he says it. But that's what writers do. They tell stories, and even if it's true stories, they have a way of embellishing them to make them larger than life, grander. It's like the old, you know, the fish tales. A fisherman doesn't catch a little bitty minnow, he catches, a huge fish. Um, because that's just the tales you tell. You tell the tales that are going to be entertaining and remembered and talked about. But they're making fun of this writer because he's drunk and he's drooling and he's babbling and he's telling the same old stories and same old stories and same old stories that they hear every day over and over again. And it talks about, people will come to that. People come to him to tell those stories and tell those stories night after night after night. They come to hear him tell these same stories about his wives, about bullfighting, about fishing, about the wars, and about his friends. But ultimately, he ends up dying alone, taking his own life alone. Depression is a horrible disease, and there's no doubt from what I've learned about Hemingway that at the end times it was depression that took him. His writing wasn't doing as well. His stories weren't coming to him. They weren't selling as well. And he was reliving the past a lot, because that was about the time he was writing A Movable Feast, and he was writing about a time in his life that he really romanticized. It probably wasn't as great as what he remembered it to be, but it was much grander a time than the life he was currently living, and as he was older. And I think he felt the only way out was suicide. And I think alcohol definitely played a part in that. Depression definitely played a part in that. And a lot of times writers are romanticized after they commit suicide too, because they have this big grand life and then this tragic end, and it all plays into the life of the writer. And I think that line in there, the price of creation is never too high, really kind of sums that up. These people came to him to hear these stories night after night after night in these bars, and he was creating these stories night after night after night, and elaborating, and to make these grand stories, these elaborate tales. That's a form of creation. Every night he was having to perform for these people every single night, and they didn't care. These people were making fun of him and kind of egging him on and criticizing him and poking and prodding and that price there was never a price too high for them. It didn't really matter what it was doing to Ernest Hemingway at the time, how it was affecting him. They just wanted their stories, and they wanted to be able to make a spectacle of him. And, ultimately, the price for his creation was his suicide, was his death. And then the line, the price of living with people is always too high. With other people always is. It's hard to live with other people, especially for someone who's been alone. Ernest Hemingway, though, was very much a people person. I don't know that he would have been able to live alone. He went from relationship to relationship to relationship, and he was always surrounding himself with other people. So I don't think it was the people that he was close to that caused the problem. I think it was the people that wanted him to always be performing and always making a spectacle of himself. It's what he's referencing in this poem. Or it could be a little self-reflection, because Bukowski was very much a loner. He very much, he had women, and he had a lot of women, and he kept some women around longer than others and lived with some women. But ultimately, he was he kept to himself. He liked to be alone. He wanted to be alone. He kept himself in seclusion, and that's where he was creative there. So being on stage and performing every night and having to be on and entertain these people night after night after night with these stories and these grandiose tales and elaborate retellings of life would not be something that Bukowski would have really enjoyed at all. That would have been hell to him every night. Even his readings that he did poetry readings for a living before he sold a lot of books, and he absolutely hated it. The only reason he did live performances of his poetry readings was because he was getting a paycheck, and he hated every minute of it. But Ernest Hemingway was one of those characters who really thrived on being around people. He thrived on storytelling and wanted to be around people. And, you know, like I said, he had many wives. He didn't ever have a time in his life where he was single. He went from wife to wife to wife, usually overlapping a little bit of the relationship. He had his next wife before he finished with the first wife, or the previous wife. But living as a creative person, living with someone else does take a toll on things and on your life and on your creativity, and just maintaining relationships it's hard anyway, and it takes effort. So, you know, what was that part of the price of that creation? Was it ultimately having to always be on? Was that ultimately what led to Hemingway's depression and ultimate suicide? But so I think this poem is really a good tribute to Bukowski dealing with the loss and grief and emotions that come with all of that of this person that he considered a friend, this fellow writer, Ernest Hemingway, and how he saw his life and how he saw especially the end times there, right there before right there at the time of his death. So that's it. That is what I've got for this discussion. What did you get out of this poem? Was there anything else that you pulled out of it? Do you think at the end, when he talks about the price of creation is never too high, the price of living with other people always is, do you think that is Bukowski talking about himself and reflecting on his own life and his own personal preferences? Or do you think that was him reflecting on Ernest Hemingway's life and Ernest Hemingway's preferences? And you guys know what to do at this point. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure and give me a thumbs up. Go and hit that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. And be sure to leave me a comment below. If you don't have anything Bukowski related, definitely just leave me a hello or an emoji of some sort. That lets me know that you were here and allows me to still interact with you in the comments below. So until next time, when I have a new Bukowski poem to talk about with you, I'll talk to you later. Bye.